Today I wanted to talk about the survival horror genre. More specifically, I want to talk about the things a survival horror game needs in order to be considered, well, survival horror. Over the last few years, it seems that practically any game that features zombies or horror is automatically labelled a survival horror. Games like Dead Island, Until Dawn, and Bioshock. These games may have horror elements, but they are not true survival horror games in my honest opinion. Today, most quote-unquote survival horror games have checkpoints every few minutes, no resource management, and a focus on cheap scares and shock value. It seems like traditional survival horror games have gone the way of the dodo in recent years, so today I'm going to list some of the key traits I believe every survival horror game needs in order to be truly called a survival horror game. This list is my own opinion, and some people will probably disagree with me, so feel free to share your thoughts on what you think defines a survival horror game in the comments. So without further ado, let's get started. Number 1. Punishment for death. This one is key in my opinion. The clue is in the name. It's called survival horror, not trial and error horror. In recent years we've seen games like Outlast and Amnesia do away with punishment for death in their survival horror games. While I adore both these titles, I wasn't a fan of how either of these games punish players for dying. Amnesia simply respawns you a few seconds earlier from where you died, and what's worse, if you die enough times, the enemies in the area will simply disappear, allowing you to progress without any fear of death. This kind of approach to game design promotes trial and error gameplay, which can completely destroy any horror or tension the game may have otherwise had. I mean, why take things slow in Outlast when you can brute force your way through any situation with pure trial and error? Alien Isolation is an example of a game that did this kind of thing right. Alien Isolation has manual saving, but these save points are frequent enough to never feel like you're losing that much progress if you die. Furthermore, because the player can't use checkpoints as a crutch, they will begin to play more cautiously because they don't want to lose all that progress. This also makes the game a lot more tense and scary, because you know death might be around the next corner, and you know the punishment for death is severe. So you begin using all the tools at your disposal to help you survive long enough to reach the next save point. It's almost as if you're fighting for your very life, which is the whole point of a survival horror game. Number 2. Resource management. A lot of survival horror games today either overwhelm you with ammo and healing supplies, or they go the opposite route and remove combat altogether. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with either of these approaches, but they rob the player of one of the most enjoyable aspects of any survival horror game, making every bullet count. The early Resident Evil games weren't only scary because they had zombies and other monsters, they were scary because you were often not equipped to deal with the threats you faced. Instead of being able to blow away every zombie or hunter in the area, you would sometimes have to run instead, and this created a lot of tense moments, wondering if you would make it to safety with the few bullets you had remaining. Number 3. Metroidvania level design. A key element of any survival horror game is exploration. Being a linear third-person shooter like The Evil Within does not make you a survival horror game. Ironically, the best chapter in that game is the only chapter that even vaguely resembles a traditional survival horror game. Linear survival horror games have the problem that once you've bypassed a certain area, you know you're safe and won't have to face that same location or monster again. Survival horror games with Metroidvania style level design ratchet the tension up with new monsters appearing in old locations you're familiar with. It can also be terrifying having to return to a location you know is filled with danger with only a few bullets on you. Exploration feeds into the survival aspect of survival horror. You're exploring to stay alive, to find ammo and health before you run out, to find that key that will allow you to escape from this nightmare. When you're being funneled down linear hallways, that fight for survival is practically non-existent. Number 4. Disempowerment to empowerment. I've already brought up the importance of making the player feel vulnerable in a survival horror game. However, it's just as important to eventually let the player let loose and get their own back on all the monsters who have terrorized them throughout the game. A good survival horror game will start you off with the most basic tools to keep you alive: a weak pistol, a survival knife, or a crowbar, and a map of the area, of course. However, through exploration and puzzle solving, the player will eventually find better guns and items that will make survival a lot easier. By the end of the game, you should feel like an unstoppable killing machine. Think of Ripley in the first two Alien films. In the first film, she's unprepared and inexperienced, and she barely escapes with her life. However, by the end of the second movie, she's a total badass who won't let anything get in her way. She went from being the hunted to being the hunter. It's a really satisfying arc to see play out in both movies and video games. Number 5. Atmosphere and sound design. This is such an obvious one, but you'd be surprised how many survival horror games get this wrong. If you can't become immersed in the location you are in, then the sense of horror is greatly diminished. When I think of games with amazing atmosphere, I think of Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil Remake, Fatal Frame 2, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, among many others. These games had environments that felt like real places, and sound design that constantly put you on edge. If all you're hearing when playing a survival horror game is the sound of gunfire and heads exploding, you're doing it wrong. So that's my little piece on what makes a great survival horror game. Not my most in-depth video, but I will talk more extensively about these topics in future reviews. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.